What's up guys, my name is Sean from White Jade Productions, and in today's video, we're gonna be going over the 5 most important video camera features you need in your next camera. Now, just to preface, I've been in the video creating space for almost a decade, and I have used a lot of different cameras. I've used every major camera brand out there. In fact, I've used almost every camera brand that there is out there on some paid professional gig or another. And I can say without a doubt that there are 5. And yes, 5 features you will definitely need in your video making career. So without further ado, okay, future Sean interrupting real quick before we jump into things. I do want to say that this is an all-encompassing video. This isn't really talking about film. I know I do that most of the time on the channel. This is all-encompassing. We're talking about the best points for film, TV, commercials, music videos, and all the way on the videography side for weddings, mini docs, and shooting just commercials and fun stuff with your friends. This is just what I would encompass video creation. This isn't cinematography. This isn't videography. This is just everything and my points for everything, just because you might shoot a little bit of everything. Back to past Sean with the points. Let's get into it. At the bottom of the list, and number 5 is slow motion. Now, the reason it's at the bottom is you just don't need it for everything. A lot of narrative content you just will never need slow motion for. You don't necessarily even need to get a camera that has great slow motion, but you do need to have it at the ready, because there will be times in which you need slow motion, or you find yourself lacking a gimbal or some other stabilization device where you might need to rely on slow-mo to get some creamy, smooth motion. And that can only be done with slow-mo a lot of the times, or sometimes a client asks you to capture something in slow motion, and maybe you'd rather not crop into your image, which can be an inhibitor of a lot of cheaper mirrorless cameras, specifically Lumix. I love Lumix to death, but to get a camera that shoots full frame, open gate, slow motion, you're gonna need to shell out over $2,500. And if you really want the good stuff, you're gonna get the S1 II, and that's $3,200 or $3,300. It's a lot of money. A camera I would 100% recommend, I would say that it is the FX3 Killer, and I'm not the only one calling it that, but it's a lot of money. And if you don't have that, then even getting a camera that does crop into Super 35, like the S5, S5 II, S5 IIX, in order to get that slow motion, that might be worth it to you for your own needs. That's my take on slow motion. On to the next point. Your camera should probably have some kind of anamorphic support. Now, with the rise of full frame anamorphic lenses at a very, very budget price, in fact, I'd argue some budget anamorphics are cheaper than some budget spherical glass, it's just a must-have that you have to have anamorphic support. Brands like Sony and Canon are falling very far behind in this area. However, brands like Lumix are pioneering it with their anamorphic IBIS, which if you are an anamorphic lover, I would suggest strongly buying a Lumix camera, because that anamorphic IBIS will save your butt, make your shots smooth, and you'll get to use all the anamorphic lenses that you like. I personally am a big fan of anamorphic. In fact, I'm shooting on it right now. I have my Lumix S5 set up with the Helios 442 and the Sirui 1.25x anamorphic adapter. This is a favorite combo of mine. It gives me scope aspect ratios pretty much right out of the box. I can't complain about it, and I love pairing it up with my Lumix because of that anamorphic IBIS. But even if you get a camera that doesn't have anamorphic IBIS, at least get one that has anamorphic D-squeeze in the camera. Because while yes, you may use a monitor that has anamorphic D-squeeze, you never know when you might need to place something back and you'll need that feature, or if you have to mount your camera on a car or some other device where you can't attach a monitor and you might need to see what the actual image looks like on your screen, not to mention using guides. To be able to even use guides, you're gonna have to have that D-squeeze in camera. You just need anamorphic support. On to the next point, false color. Now, I'll be honest, there's some pretty prominent brands like Canon in particular that still have not added false color into their high-end mirrorless cameras or even their cinema cameras, and it's frustrating. I won't work with a camera professionally on set if it doesn't have false color. Now, this video is pretty much all encompassing. I'm not really talking about filmmaking in particular, but I'm also not talking about freelance videography. This is kind of a what you should have in your camera kit. Now, if I'm going to do a wedding, I need false color. If I'm gonna do a commercial or a short film, I need false color. If I'm gonna go shoot a YouTube video, not necessarily. If I'm going to shoot some run and gun stuff, it'd be nice, again, not necessary. However, For a lot of paid things, getting my exposure perfect, getting the skin tones correct in camera is a must. And it's very difficult to do without false color, and it has to be native within the camera for a lot of reasons I'm not gonna get into in this video, but brands like Canon have fallen very far behind. Brands like Sony are still catching up. I cannot agree with the statement that a lot of their cameras are cinema cameras when they don't come native with false color, histograms, and a lot of other features that are just necessary for cinema production at any kind of budgeted level. Again, this is why I chose to shoot with Lumix in the first place and why I bought into them as a brand. They have all of the features and they have had them for about half a decade, even on some of their lower end cameras, which is absolutely incredible. If you've never used false color and you think that the little plus minus histogram, I wouldn't even call it a histogram, on your camera is good enough, I would advise you to maybe rent a camera or rent a monitor where you can actually test out some of these features and watch how it impacts your footage. You will spend less time in the grade and your footage will look a whole lot cleaner and overall better. Now, moving on to our second to last point is dynamic range. Now, I know if you haven't shot with any cinema camera or you haven't crawled your way up from the dumps with some really crappy DSLRs, you might not really consider dynamic range to be a big deal, but I promise you it is. Now, I will go right off the bat and tell you that almost every single mirrorless camera brand lies to you about how much dynamic range you get out of your camera. The FX3 does get 15 plus stops of dynamic range in photo mode. In video mode, it's 13.2. It's a pretty big difference. 13 is the average. All of the Blackmagic cameras, all their pro cameras, the Pixis, it's getting 13 stops. I'd actually wager it's a little bit more, but that's what they claim. They're actually one of the only truthful brands. The Pixis 12K, again, cheaper than an FX6, probably a little more expensive than an FX3 all rigged out at 5 grand, has 16 stops of dynamic range. 16 stops is what I would consider the comfy zone. When I shoot on my Red Dragon over here, this is like legit one of my favorite cameras of all time, 16.2 stops of dynamic range. I'm getting 3 more stops than I am on the FX3. Now, if you know how dynamic range works, that means I'm getting about 1.5 stops in my shadows. In other words, I see 1.5 stops more into my shadows, effectively meaning that I don't have to turn up my ISO nearly as much, about 1.5 stops as much. So while an FX3 might see really well at 12,800, my camera can still grab a nice image around 4,000 or 5,000 without having to push my ISO nearly that high. Huge feature. Not to mention, when I'm out shooting in direct sunlight, where I'll be shooting on an FX3 or my Lumix S5, and I'll notice that I really have to tune in my VND or my ISO to make sure I'm not too dark, and I'm also not clipping or rolling off my highlights to a point where the sky that is blue in real life looks white on my camera. I just don't have to worry about that with a camera that has 16 stops of dynamic range. I'd argue that anything more than 14.5 or 15 is probably good enough, but 16 makes my life easier. If you're gonna buy a camera and you're gonna upgrade and you're thinking about maybe getting a cinema camera, I would strongly suggest buying a Komodo or the Pixis 12K. Those are my 2 cameras right now that I think perform the best in terms of dynamic range that are new. Now, if you're curious about the Red Dragon, I have plenty of videos on my channel. Feel free to go check them out. I think it's a great camera in 2025, even though it's very old, and there are plenty of other good cameras like the Sony F5 that I still think are absolutely phenomenal for the price, even in 2025. But if you want something new, the Komodo KX, specifically Komodo X, and the Pixis 12K in particular, I think are your best buys. One is large format, one is Super 35, but they both have RAW capabilities. And that's my next point. My final point, the most important feature your camera can have is RAW. Now, I'll be honest, external RAW, if it's B-RAW, is okay. I don't mind it. It's fine. It's not the greatest. It does work for narrative, but I'd stop it there. Internal RAW is where cameras do the best. Specifically, internal RAW that can be imported into DaVinci Resolve. I don't want to hear anything about ProRes RAW or Cinema DNG. They're just hard codecs to work with. They're not my favorite. Personally, I absolutely love working with R3D and B-RAW straight out of camera. They just are the best codecs, particularly R3D. Here's a little screen recording of me working on a shot. You see how much manipulation I have with the image. I can control my highlight roll-off. People complain a lot about, particularly Sony, Canon, Nikon, having some rough highlight roll-off. Aside from the FX3 and A7S III, there can be some pretty sharp highlight roll-off when compared to cinema cameras. And even Blackmagic can have some harsh highlight roll-off. I think the Pixis and the shared sensor with their pocket full frame or their cinema camera full frame, I just think it's a little harsh. You can control that with Red. It's a lot of flexibility. Not to mention that ISO value is highly adjustable, all the way from 80 all the way up to 12,800. I would never push it that high, but you at least have the ability to. Adjusting your color temperature and tint in camera is just extremely valuable to me because it allows you to really focus on set or whatever your project is and just focus on the creative aspect and not worry about the technical side of it as much because you can change it later. Now, if you have the time, if you're working on a commercial, you should have a show LUT and everything set up. If you're working on music videos or feature films, you should have show LUTs built in and you should have it set up, but if need be, you can change it later. However, when I'm shooting weddings or documentary style content or sports where I need to be on the ball and focusing on what's happening, because if I miss it, I don't get that shot. Being able to change my stuff after the fact is huge. It's huge. Knowing that I have all that dynamic range and it's raw means that I almost never clip anything. I almost never underexpose anything. It's never overexposed. It's never messed up. Now, and that's why I kind of chose the Red Dragon as a camera. It's a 1.17 crop from full frame, so it's almost full frame. I get all of the benefits of slow motion and all of the benefits of raw and high dynamic range out of that camera, which is why I chose it. Now, if I had to go back and pick a different camera, I would personally pick the Pixis 12K for $5,000. It's currently the best camera on the market. Not only do I think it's the best camera on the market under $10,000, maybe even under 15, I would argue that it is the best deal, obviously. For $5,000, why would you buy an FX6 when you can get that unless you need autofocus, which the Pixis 12K does have, and I will say it'll probably get better over the next 6 to 8 months. But those are my 5 points of what you need in your next camera. Obviously, budget restrictions may apply, but those are my top 5 points and what I think matter most in any video working space, whether that is in the film industry doing feature films, TV shows, documentaries, commercials, or music videos, or even in more of the videography space where you're doing a little bit more weddings, smaller, short docs, you're doing a lot of cheaper commercials for people. In either of those sides of the spectrum, I would say that those are my 5 biggest points. And while you don't always need each individual of those points, I would say that they are big. And if you can get them in a singular camera, go for it. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time.